Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Unlocking the Power of OTAs. Thank you so much for investing this time with us and our industry leaders. If you are an APMP member, this webinar will apply toward your continuing education units for certification, so make sure you apply those. And as with all Shipley webinars, this presentation will be uploaded to our website by tomorrow. So please share with your colleagues and anyone who might benefit from today's discussion. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions tab rather than the chat, but into the questions tab of your control panel, and we will answer as many as we can in a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So before we get started, we wanted to tell you a little bit about Shipley. We are a consulting, training, and professional services firm. We've been around for 50 years, over 50 years really, and we have offered many consulting and training services, much like this free webinar. So we are so glad you're here and taking part in that. So after the webinar, if you decide you need to learn so much more about OTAs, because this is a very rich topic with many things to discuss today, but there's even more in our corporate training offerings that we have. So if you want to learn more, at the end, we will have some links and some QR codes so you can contact us and learn more about our OTA training. All right, Nia, I am going to pass the mic to you to discuss our agenda for this session and to introduce both you and Patrick.
Thank you so much, Mallory. My name is Nia Mahalati. I'm the Senior VP of Professional Services at Shipley, and that includes training. We do have an OTA training course, which is a one-day, and it's in thorough detail with exercises, with live time, how to find OTAs, and all kinds of great things. So we're going to be touching on some of those topics today. We also have extensive amount of OTA consulting. As we know, with the new administration, OTAs are becoming more and more prevalent. So we certainly have that option for you. If you want to reach out to us, we will be providing a QR code where you can reach out. You can also go through our website, and we'll be more than happy to discuss our services with you. With that, I'm going to take it into the agenda, and then I'm going to turn it over to Patrick. So what are we going to be talking about today? Obviously, the introduction to OTAs. What are OTAs? How do they serve the government? How are they different from traditional acquisitions? The strategic impacts of the new administration and DOGE on OTAs. How do we find OTAs, consortiums? What are they? How do we get on them? What is their role versus, in non-traditional contracting environment? Capture management for OTAs is obviously next, followed by proposal management and writing for OTAs. Then we're going to cover a little bit about what's negotiable in OTAs, how are they different, and how are they similar to the FAR. And then we're going to get into common myths, and finally questions and answers. So to be prepared, it's going to be about 40 minutes of coverage with whatever questions you may have. We'll take the ones that we see the most of, and we'll address those. So you will have the opportunity to ask your questions at the latter part of the webinar for about 20 minutes. We normally do these interactive, more of a discussion, but because of the dense nature of this material and the fact that we have our expert, Patrick Barrett, who developed the course for us, who teaches us, he's one of our senior instructors, and we want to try to get as much information to you as possible. So this is going to be more of a Patrick covering the slides rather than a discussion, just because of the technical nature and content of the material. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Patrick, if you could give us a brief introduction of yourself and then lead us into the webinar.
Absolutely, and thank you, Nia, and thank you, Mallory, and thank you to everybody at Shipley Associates for this opportunity to be here today, and appreciate everyone's time. I know we've got quite a few people online, and I'm really hoping today is going to be very valuable for you, and hoping we can help your business go out and win some new opportunities. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I started off my career at Lockheed Martin. I was there for over 23 years, started off engineering, operations, program management, did all of those types of things. Then I got into business development. And within my business development role at Lockheed, I was focused on creating non-traditional partnerships across Lockheed. At the time, the adaptive acquisition framework was a brand new framework being put in place by the government to help streamline some of the overall acquisition approach. And OTAs were really a central part of that adaptive acquisition framework in terms of strategy for how to move fast, how to be flexible overall. So with that, I ended up getting an opportunity to be the CEO of Catalyst Campus for Technology and Innovation. So I left Lockheed, and while I was at Catalyst Campus, we focused on helping to work with small businesses, actually mid-sized, large companies, best of breed across academia, government, and industry, to create dual-use technologies, help facilitate tech transfer. We typically operated under a partnership intermediary agreement, which is another type of a non-FAR based contract vehicle, but OTAs were really central to what we worked with small businesses with. From there, I went back into industry, went to another small business, non-traditional company, and I'm currently the Vice President of Strategic Growth at OMNI Federal. And then because I absolutely love teaching and I love learning and interacting with people, I'm also teaching part-time with Shipley Associates, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So first of all, what is an other transaction? It's kind of a funny thing to even introduce in terms of a term, but an other transaction is anything that's not FAR-based. So if you essentially eliminated all the FAR-based procurements, you're essentially left with the other transaction authority. And we're going to get into the history of OTAs and how that term actually came about. So there are multiple types of OTAs per the United States law. So there's three different types: research OTAs, prototype OTAs, and production OTAs. Predominantly, what most companies are probably working with are prototype OTAs today, but I'm just going to briefly cover all three. So a research OTA is essentially put in place to help pursue dual-use technologies through basic, applied, and advanced research. And there's formal definitions of basic, applied, and advanced. And essentially, the goal is to build that research project to come up with a dual-use technology that then could be prototyped, and that's where you move into prototype OTAs. And those prototype OTAs have obviously the specific definition of what can and cannot be acquired through a prototype. And then once that prototype is complete, the government can actually sole source into a production OTA. So that production OTA does not require any type of additional competition. I'm going to keep using the term flexibility, but really what OTAs are all about is getting rid of all the red tape, creating a flexible approach that allows the government to put capability on contract quickly. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So just a few things about OTAs. So they are obviously legally binding, but what they are not, they are not a standard procurement, a grant, cooperative agreement. They're not subject to any of the federal acquisition regulations or the FAR supplements. They're not subject to the Defense Contract Audit Agency going through and doing their audits that, again, you're probably familiar with on FAR-based side. They're not limited in terms of the overall dollar amount. So the government can, there are thresholds that the government has to maintain in order to have authority to put them out, but they ultimately can have very large dollar amounts. One example of that is a contract called DARK, several $100 million contract that was put out a few years ago, and it was probably one of the largest of its kind at the time. Also, you're permitted to openly discuss and collaborate with the government. This is really the beauty of an OTA. A lot of times in FAR-based procurements, we feel a little bit stuck. Like, we have all these great capabilities, we want to go solve the government's problems, but there's this barrier between us and our customers. And in an OTA environment, we're actually able to have open discussions and collaborate with them. And ultimately, the goal is to develop and deliver the right technology at the right time to solve a hard problem for them. And then typically, an OTA is not allowed to be protested, but we'll actually talk about a little bit later about a way that it can be protested. Next slide, please. So I want to take just a moment. This is, if you can Google this, it's the Defense Acquisition University has put out this thing called the contracting cone. So if you type in, DAU contracting cone, something similar to this will pull up. Everything on the left in the blue, those are all FAR-based procurements. So FAR-based procurements are the ones that you're probably very familiar with. FAR 15 negotiated contracts, FAR 16 505, the multi-award IDIQs. But ultimately, what we're focused on today are the non-FAR-based agreements. So you can see the OTAs over in the green, the research, the prototype that are defined there. This is a great resource for getting interactive information on pros and cons of all of the different types of contracts, including OTAs. So highly encourage everybody to spend a little bit of time on DAU's website using this tool. The government obviously trains their acquisition professionals on how to use this, and if you're on the industry side of the house, it's great to understand as well. Next slide.
Before you go on to the next slide, Patrick, 2 comments on what you said. One, the DoD threshold is about 500 million. Anything above that needs congressional approval. Other organizations, it's similar. They don't normally go above that. If they do, it's agency specific though. And then the second is what Patrick is referring to as far as communications with the government is concerned. In the FAR, they restrict after RFP actually communications. Anything that's not black and white expressly stated in the FAR or federal provisions then defaults to agency specific. So they do have some flexibility in terms of communications. However, what Patrick's saying is since that FAR restriction is not there, you have the ability to ask questions, answers, shape this type of thing a little bit more than you would otherwise. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks, Nia, for adding that. So this is a really fun history lesson. So we're hearing everything about OTAs. We have 289 people on this call right now to learn about OTAs. We're hearing the current administration foot stomping OTAs, but OTAs are not new. So in 1957, I think everyone's familiar with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, which was the first man-made satellite that was launched into space. And it really launched the overall space race between the United States and the USSR. And what Congress did is they responded in 1958 by creating a brand new agency called NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And they wanted to make sure that NASA had the ability to move quickly. We were in a space race, and we didn't want to be inhibited by a lot of red tape and policy. So NASA was given the overall freedom to carry on research, development, and exploration, and essentially make sure that they didn't have any unnecessary delay. So that Space Act granted NASA this broad authority to enter into and perform such contracts and other transactions as may be necessary to accomplish its mission of research exploration. So other transactions, that's where the term other transaction actually originated, was coming out of the Space Act establishing NASA. And you can go ahead and build this slide out all the way. So from that original 1958 Space Act, NASA obviously continued working with OTAs. Other agencies started coming in, but the DoD was originally given the authority for their research OTAs in FY 1989, and then prototype OTAs in 1994. And then they went on to expand those authorities in 2015. And then in 2016, the National Defense Authorization Act permanently codified the Department of Defense Other Transaction Authority for prototype projects. So you'll hear me giving a lot of DoD related examples throughout this, but we'll talk about all the different agencies that can actually have the authority to use OTs. Next. And here we are. So there's 10 federal agencies today that have the ability to issue OTs. I'm not going to read them all for you, but you can see them on the left. The big thing really to take away here is that over the course of FY20 through FY24, so that's a 5-year period, there was $77 billion spent in OTAs across the federal government. And if you looked at a graph trending between those years, Army spending actually trended down, but overall Air Force, Defense, Navy, Health and Human Services significantly trended up. So there's significant increases in trends. And when you see Air Force, think it's Air Force and Space Force, because Space Force is part of the Department of Air Force. So you're starting to see huge trends in increase in the use of OTA, and we're only going to see that increase with the current administration's policies. Next slide, please. So the current administration obviously wants to make sure that we can deliver technologies and capabilities that allow us to protect and defend our nation as quickly as possible. Technology, as we know, is moving at such a rapid pace right now. Our adversaries are not, they're not inhibited by a lot of red tape and things like the federal acquisition regulations. If you think of countries like China and Russia, they don't have something called the FAR. So the current administration wants to make sure that those peer adversaries, that we can keep up with them when it comes to protecting and defending our country. So they are putting out policies that allow us to use OTAs across the board, and not just allowing, but encouraging the use of those OTAs. So we'll talk a little bit about those policies next. All right, so I'm sure everyone has seen the news in the last year to some extent, and specifically a lot of the executive orders coming out of the current administration. But I'm going to point out a few that I think are pretty important for everybody here to be aware of. So the first is back in April, the Modernizing Defense Acquisitions and Spurring Innovation within the Defense Industrial Base, or the DIB. That basically allows us to, or allows the government to expedite acquisitions, and ultimately it called out specifically other transaction authorities in calling for a general preference for those other transaction authorities. So instead of saying we're going to go FAR first and then look at OTs, the administration is saying look at OTs first. If you can't use them, then go down a different acquisition path. And in highly encouraging the Department of Defense to prioritize the use of those authorities. Next slide, please. And then also in April, you probably also saw the Restoring Common Sense in Federal Procurement. And this is a overall look at the FAR. I would expect to see changes to the FAR that are going to be happening now. We're already starting to see small changes, but larger changes coming to the FAR. But overall, this particular executive order didn't talk about OTAs specifically, but it did talk about that they want to make sure that federal procurement is going to happen faster, that we can get capabilities out faster, we can acquire goods and services faster, and that's a huge impact. And then that just over a month ago in August, there was another DoD memo changing the overall requirements process for the federal government, and the JSIDs that a lot of you are familiar with, the Joint Capabilities Integration Development System, that's been overall eliminated. And that's that overall horse blanket that I think if you've been around for a while, you've seen where acquisition professionals had to tailor out. Now with the adaptive acquisition framework and the elimination of the JSIDs, we're now tailoring in what's needed when it comes to requirements. It's allowing the government to move much faster, and then obviously enable the use of OTAs. Next slide.
And with that, before you get into your next topic, Patrick, the OTAs, when Patrick's saying that the government's primarily looking at whether or not the OTA can apply and go through that route or that vehicle versus the regular, this is primarily for R&D prototyping. That's what this was developed for. So the core competency matters, right? So when we say that, it's with the caveat of R&D prototyping, because the government was taking way too long for the prototyping, which then creates additional risk. So within the context of R&D prototyping, you're looking at this primarily as the first option. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nia. So you've probably heard me use the term at least once so far today, a non-traditional defense contractor. I work for one, OMNI Federal. I've worked for non-traditional defense contractors in the past, but what are they? And it's really important to know, because if you don't know that term, the use of OTAs, there's a huge preference for the use of non-traditional defense contractors when it comes to using OTAs. So what are they? There's four different tenets. And number one, they're small businesses exempt from CAS requirements. So they technically don't need to be a small business. There's a formal definition of small business, but they have to be exempt from the cost accounting standards. So cost accounting standards become levied upon a company if they've worked more than $50 million in CAS covered efforts. Typically, you see this with primarily cost plus type contracts, and less in fixed price type contracts. So you can see here, so number one, exempt from CAS. Number two, exclusively performing contracts under commercial procedures. So companies that are doing more commercial work, in commercial solution openings, things like that, they also would be considered non-traditional. We already mentioned the less than 50 million in CAS covered over the course of an entire year for whatever that accounting period is. And then the fourth is performing, again, exclusively under firm fixed price contracts with adequate price competition. So again, cost plus contracts, you start performing more than 50 million a year, and all of a sudden you're not a non-traditional defense contractor. Next slide. So how do I go out and find an OT? I think that if you've never gone out and bid on an OT before, it may be a little bit daunting because you may just be familiar with FAR-based contracts and using SAM.gov, but know that SAM.gov is also a great resource. So OTs can be advertised on SAM.gov. The government is also trying what I would call non-traditional advertising overall. So they're looking for other ways to get information out about, because remember, they're trying to reach non-traditional defense contractors. So if you're a non-traditional, you may or may not spend a lot of time on SAM.gov. So they've created websites, they've created distribution lists, lots of different ways for the government to reach out and try to connect with these non-traditional companies. Social media, probably less on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and more on LinkedIn. But I've seen, like, the Space Development Agency, for example, is a great example. I mean, they're putting almost every single one of their opportunities out on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a great resource for finding out about, follow customers in organizations that you want to work with, that you have capabilities that you can go help solve some of their problems, and that's another great one. There's obviously different crowdsourcing, market intel campaigns. I mean, I think everyone else, call it AppWorks. AppWorks does quite a few different challenges, and they'll use OTs as their acquisition vehicle. And then the other one is creating or joining a consortia. And we'll talk a little bit more about consortia shortly, but a consortia is essentially an opportunity for you as a company to join with other consortia members, and they can be both traditional and non-traditional companies. And that consortia manages on behalf of an agency. There's typically a company managing the consortia on behalf of an agency that help to build teaming. They help with connecting those members with the right opportunities that they can go out and bid. So think of it as really an intermediary between the government and industry. Next slide, please. So, I'm going to deep dive a little bit more on OTA consortiums, and the one that I always like to call out, because I already mentioned it before when I helped to actually bid in and win it when I was at Catalyst Campus, was the Space Enterprise Consortium that's managed by NSTXL. There are literally hundreds of consortium, and one thing to note, that Shipley has a full day class that Nia mentioned before, but in that class we actually get into how to find the right consortium, how to join those consortiums, how to match your business capabilities with those consortiums. So, that's a great thing to check out. You don't have to work within a consortium though to work on OTAs, so you've got both sides of it. And then understanding that non-traditional defense contractor in a little bit more detail. We'll talk about that next. So, why consider working with a consortium? It's probably the easiest way to get involved in other transactions, because you have an intermediary, that company that's managing the consortium, that's actively helping to promote opportunities. They're actively helping to create membership meetings, connecting companies that have complementary capabilities together, so they can move very quickly, and help companies that maybe don't have a lot of literacy with OTs to understand the OT process, and work with the government to help with, bid and win those OT type contracts. So they do a lot of reverse industry days, a lot of like open dialogue type of things. So definitely check out the OT consortiums next.
Patrick, here some of our participants may want to know, is there any requirements for different OTAs and what those entail? How long is the process to get on and this type of thing, and to maintain your position on one?
Yeah, there are requirements. I mean, typically to join an OT consortium, there's a cost associated with it. There's some initial paperwork that has to be done. You have to be, a company in good standing and go through a process to be registered, and depending on the type of work that's being done, a lot of times it's controlled, unclassified information. So there's some type of a portal that you need to have access to actually get in and see the information that's protecting that CUI data. So who is eligible to receive an OTA award? So we already talked about the non-traditional defense contractor. Obviously, they can go out, they can bid OTs. Remember, that's really what the government's trying to get at. They're trying to get at the capabilities of non-traditional defense contractors. However, traditional defense contractors a lot of times have a lot to offer, depending on what the solution is. So the awardee can either be, a non-traditional with a traditional as a partner, or it could be all non-traditionals, or you could have a traditional defense contractor leading an overall OTA as prime, but they do need to bring in significant participation from a non-traditional. And that's typically about a 1/3 cost share overall. So when you're putting together a team, if you're a traditional company, be thinking about what non-traditionals can I bring in and help enhance my solution. If you're non-traditional, think about maybe building a team of all non-traditionals, or maybe you do need a traditional, but that traditional doesn't need to be super significant in terms of overall work share. So when it comes to teaming, when it comes to bidding on these opportunities, it's really, really important to understand that non-traditional role and understand the importance behind why the government is trying to do this, right? They're trying to get new technology. They're trying to make sure that that this technology that they've never had before, because it's non-traditional, is able to be baked into their solutions. So next slide, please. So when it comes to overall capture management for OTA opportunities, you can imagine with the flexibility that the government is providing within the other transaction authority, the timeline is typically much shorter. So in terms of opportunity shaping and overall solicitation engagement, if you look at, Shipley has a great process for overall business development, all the way from initial through post capture win and documenting lessons learned, and that process still needs to be followed, but it needs to be streamlined when it comes to OTAs. And when you're a capture manager, know that you have a lot more open access to the government. If you're putting in a bid without talking to the government, you're probably not going to win that bid. So know who your customers are, know what their problems are, and identify and bid real solutions for those problems. And just having that mindset as a capture manager is really important. You're not going to have as much time up front that you would have in a traditional business development timeline where the government's doing extensive market research to meet market research guidelines for the FAR. A lot of times they're not doing that. Sometimes you'll see OTs drop, and a whole process, that might have been a couple of years in a FAR 15, could end up being a much shorter. Somehow I lost let's see, end poll. Are the slides still up? Oh, there we go. Okay, next slide. So proposal management and writing. So we just talked a little bit of, very briefly about capture. And again, we deep dive this on the full day class. So know that there's a lot of information behind all of this. But when it comes to proposal management and writing, there are a few major differences. Keep in mind that that the Uniform Contract Act under the FAR, which very clearly defines, attachment, L, M, C, everything that you're used to seeing. None of that's going to exist. Everything is going to be, written in terms of, there'll be instructions, there'll be evaluation criteria, there'll be some type of a statement of work. But the government's just trying to get at solutions quickly. So you're going to see white papers, quad charts, orals, things like that. Also know that, the government is really driving at innovation. They want evidence and data that you are innovative, that you have products that you can, that you have discriminators, that you're putting in, the benefit of, not just the feature and proof points and everything, and think concise, focused, and then also think risk mitigation. The government is very, very keen on risk and making sure that if there is a risk, that you're talking about how you're going to mitigate that risk. Next slide. So when it comes to negotiating OTAs versus FAR contracts, again, completely different, right? So flexibility is really key. And I think I've said flexibility more times than I probably needed to, but I want to foot stomp how important flexibility is. That's really the purpose of an OTA. All of the FAR, DFARs, Competition and Contracting Act, none of that applies. So the government's able to move quickly. Collaboration obviously starts early between the contractor and the government. So they're open and willing to talk to companies, especially non-traditional companies. And then when it comes to negotiating, know that typically that you're not using a model contract, right? So everything is negotiable. So intellectual property, physical property, modifications, disputes, terminations, payments, accounting, auditing, everything is negotiable. So I would highly encourage, if you are bidding OTs, to make sure you have a really strong legal and contracts team that can help make sure that you're building a win-win business case on anything that you're bidding when it comes to OTs. So we obviously want to make sure that we as companies are doing a good job of creating a good business case, but we also want to make sure it's a win for the government, that we're delivering the capabilities that we say we can deliver, and they're able to take advantage of those. So this is kind of a fun exercise to wrap up some of the materials today. I'm just going to go through a few of these common OT myths, and then we're going to move from there into some Q&A, and then we'll do a final wrap up. So with that, myth number one: since an OT is termed an agreement, it is not a contract. So that is false. And OTs are still contracts. They're obviously not procurement contracts, but they are a legally valid contract. So it's not the wild, wild west. There are rules and regulations. There's laws that pertain to OTs. So know that you are entering into a contract. All right, myth number two. And I'm gonna just do a little spoiler alert. I guess I could have done a better job of true false, but the answer is false. Again, so the Competition and Contracting Act does not apply. So a lot of people think competition and fairness are not consideration. That's false. The OT law and authorities, they still require competitive practices. There's still rules and regulations around competition and fairness. So it's not just I can go select whatever company I want to select. You still have to go through some standard guidance, but it is much more streamlined than it is with a FAR-based. Okay, OTs cannot be protested. I already told you that they generally cannot be protested, but there is an exception. So false. They can technically be protested. Again, going back to what I said before, that anything can be negotiated. So when if the agency decides they want to put language in the solicitation describing some type of a protest procedure, then technically you can protest. Is this common? No. Next slide. All right, so another myth, none of the federal statutes or regulations apply to OTs. Again, I put stomp again that there are very clear statutory guidelines associated with OTs that, again, not back to it's not the wild, wild west. They you know, they're not FAR-based contracts, but there are rules and regulations around OTs that govern their use. Next slide. And then OTs can only be awarded through a consortium. Hopefully I already dispelled that one. False. Obviously, you can enter into another transaction directly with the government. Obviously, you can also come up with many different types of teaming arrangements if it's a direct type award, but obviously consortiums are a great way to get involved. Okay, myth 6. So OT authorities can only use RDT&E appropriations. So this is another one that we see commonly, especially when you're thinking, okay, well, this is research and prototyping, and therefore it must just be RDT&E money. Technically, there are other fiscal appropriations that can be used, such as O&M type money. So if you're a company that's out there that you're thinking, gosh, I don't do, traditional development type work with that would be, subject to RDT&E type funds, there are still OT opportunities that you can probably participate in, knowing that O&M funds can be used as well. So know that that's a common myth that we can bust, so to speak. And that's it for the content. I'm going to turn it back over to Nia, and then we'll get into some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. This is great. We started off in the top 200s and we're still there. It looks like we have 13 questions. So Mallory's going to get us started with some of those. Again, if you missed the beginning part of this, if you want to click on this QR code, we can certainly, it will take you to OTA training and or OTA proposal team support that we do provide. Alternatively, you can also go to our website and ask us a question, reach out. For the OTA training, and Patrick touched on this, it's really important that your pricing people, your contracts people, your legal be in there and they be well versed, because the compliance requirements are a little bit different. And the negotiation factor is you have a little bit more discretion, so you can get an advantage there if you shape this properly with the team. So a lot of times in this OTA training, we don't just get the capture and proposal and the writing professionals, we also get the pricing, the contracts, the legal. So this is something that, unless you're in hardcore program implementation on the support end and the sales end, it's pretty much applicable across the board. So that's something to take into consideration. And then with that, we will go on to the next slide. We do have additional resources on our website. We have all kinds of guides if you're interested to learn more about capture, proposals, what that process is and how it weaves into this. Again, I think Patrick touched on this. It's an abbreviated method for the Shipley process. The capture still exists. Chances of you winning without having any communications interactions with the client are probably not as high as had you had those communications. So that's where the capture kicks in. And with that, we will go to the next slide. And we go to the Q&A. Mallory, take it away.
All right, so we have several questions to answer. Thank you all so much for submitting those. First of all, one question that seems to be on a lot of people's mind is if they can see this presentation and view the slides after today. Yes, you can. I mentioned that at the very, very beginning, so if some of you joined us late, you probably didn't hear, but we will have this presentation and a PDF of the slide deck available on our website by tomorrow, so you can look for that under the webinar section. I believe an e-blast may also go out to you, so check your email, check the website. We will have this presentation available to you to share with your colleagues and so that you can review. Okay, let's jump in. All right. So why is Army spending on OTAs so much greater than all the other services?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I pulled this data from a research site. I did not dig into the specifics behind why the Army was spending more than some of the other services. But the interesting thing is they had spent quite a bit in 2020, and as they got towards 2024, their spending had significantly decreased. So there may have been some very large acquisitions that were done back 5 years ago or so that kind of skewed the data a little bit.
Okay. All right. So to be an NDC, do you have to fall under all of the 4 elements that you showed earlier or just one?
Yeah, so you need to fall under all 4 of the elements to be a non-traditional defense contractor. So all 4 that we covered.
Okay, great. Can you explain the perform less than 50 million in CAS covered efforts requirement?
Sure. So the cost accounting standards is something that our federal government requires overall. And essentially, it's if you think about cost accounting standards, really what it is it's how you build up all your rates. It's all the details of your rates, if you've got on-call pay and all that kind of stuff. And Defense Contracting Auditing Agency goes through and they basically review your CAS disclosure, and based on your CAS disclosure, they essentially say we're approving your rates because again, if you're doing work in a cost plus type of an environment, the government wants to make sure they're not entering some type of a contract with a company where they've got an open checkbook and the company can just come up with whatever rates they want and essentially take the government's money. So the cost accounting standards are in place specifically for those cost plus type contracts. So a non-traditional has to perform less than 50 million in CAS covered efforts, meaning that if they, over the course of 1 year, if they were performing, more than 50 or more, then they would no longer be considered a non-traditional. Again, the government had to put some type of a benchmark of this is a non-traditional versus a traditional, and that's where they drew the line.
CAS doesn't apply just to DoD, it applies to other agencies as well. It's used depending on the type of award, and it's usually negotiated contracts. So it's not just DoD, it's across the board, federal agency for negotiated contracts. Go ahead, Mallory.
Okay, so Patrick, you have answered this question pretty well, but I'm wondering if you can give us just a really clean definition of non-traditional. We had a few questions about that.
Sure. So again, the 4 different elements that we talked about. So you have to be a company that's exempt, from CAS requirements. You have to be performing contracts under, commercial procedures, performing exclusively under firm fixed price, contracts with adequate price competition, and then obviously the less than 50 million for CAS covered during the preceding accounting period.
Great, thank you for going.
And then you as a company have to submit. Typically, when you're bidding, you have to submit a letter self-asserting that you are a non-traditional and why.
Okay, thank you so much. Can the government use OTAs towards socioeconomic set-asides like WOSB, SDVOSB, etc.?
So I believe the answer is yes, but I don't want to say it firmly because unless Nia knows for sure, that might be one I have to double check for you. That's a good question.
Well, we'll move
So
on for now.
I'm gonna go with that I believe the answer is yes, but we still need to. That's a good question for us to verify.
Okay. All right. Can you speak to the different solicitation frameworks that consortia or OTAs use? For example, some phases of white papers to pitches to ROMs, BAFOs, others have bake-offs or practical application events. Even still, others may have short-term but more traditional written response with multiple awardees moving to prototyping stage. What are some best practices to then address these differing frameworks in structuring capture and proposal response activities?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot there. So the government, when it comes to their acquisition approach and using OTAs, it really comes down to what objective are they trying to achieve, right? So a lot of times when they're bringing in non-traditionals, they haven't worked with them, they haven't vetted those non-traditionals like they have with some of the more traditional defense industrial base companies. So a lot of times they'll do parallel activities. So that's where you start to see maybe 4 companies or 3 companies or 2 companies that get an initial award, and there's milestones they need to achieve, and then there's some kind of a down select. And the reason the government's doing that is because they're trying to manage risk, right? They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. They know that through that prototyping effort, they're going to end up getting the best solution as quickly as they possibly can. So when it comes to to use orals or not orals, really the government wants to know that they are not just getting, and especially with AI right now, in terms of writing proposals, people can turn in proposals sometimes and maybe don't have the technical background the government really needs, but it sounds like they do when they write it. So the orals is just another vetting process that the government has for getting active Q&A and making sure that that company can truly understand and deliver on what they need to deliver. And in terms of overall capture, and I think I covered it at a very, very high level, but capture and proposal management, proposal writing, it's understanding what those requirements are up front. Again, you're not going to have a section L and an M and a C, but you are going to have an equivalent of a section L, M, and C. And so making sure that instructions to offerers, the evaluation criteria, and making sure it's crystal clear that you're as you're building out your proposal response and your working capture up front, that you're working towards the right artifacts, right? So in a traditional FAR-based capture, you'd be writing outlines and doing some initial work with drafts and things up front. Same thing here, right? If it's a white paper, if it's some slides, if it happens to be an orals pitch, whatever it might be, you're following that same process. It's just typically very short, and there's going to be in a lot of cases some type of a bake-off or parallel activities that are happening, and the government can actually they have a basket provision, right, where they can select a company, but then they can select another viable proposal. That viable proposal sits in the basket, so to speak, and if the company they selected is not performing, they can literally yank that company out, put another company in that has a viable proposal. So the government has a lot of flexibility, and their goal is to get capability delivered fast, and that's the purpose of the OTA. And hopefully that answered the question, but Nia, I'll let you, if I missed anything, you can maybe jump in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Patrick. So when we talk about the what you're talking about here, this is true, and you've got 100%. What you said about the process still applies. The reason why the process still applies is because regardless of FAR or no FAR, a lot of government agencies don't use the FAR. We just use the FAR as this blanket clause, but we're really talking about agency specific. We're talking about exceptions. We're talking about non-traditionals. Having said that, they all have one thing in common. They have to score, and they have to have a quantifiable way of scoring, because regardless of FAR or no FAR, there is a justification. It's a J&A process that they have to use in order to award and justify the dollars, even if whether there's a protest or not. So when scoring occurs, there's evaluation criteria that are predetermined. And when that happens, it may not be in a formal source selection authority or SSEB type of setting, but you have individuals with pre-selected criteria that are writing, that are scoring each section. So again, your buckets apply, right? Your bucket being your past performance, your relevant experience. It may not be formal, like Patrick said, but you still want to weave that in. Those are the things that you're looking at nailing in the capture. That's where the capture applies. So I think that's where he's going with those processes still apply. It's because at the end of the day, the scoring, the evaluation is still going to be there, right? It's not going to be as intricate as it otherwise would be. And then to go to your small business question, I didn't fully understand if the question meant, and it just because you called on me anyway, Patrick, I'll address it. If the question meant, are there formal set aside standards for OTAs, the answer is normally no. And the reason for that is the small business set aside comes from SBA, right? SBA determines them. They come from labor, the labor departments, what is a minority, and that's how it's established. So the, WOSB, SDVOSB, 8M, 8A, here you're not going to have solicitations that are released small business only and or a pool where it says pool to small business. You won't see that normally in OTAs. Having said that, you will see a lot of small businesses in consortia, and they are competing, but it's not formal like how it is in regular acquisitions, the traditional ones. I hope that answers your question. Go ahead, Mallory.
Great, thank you both. So we mentioned nonprofit just a little bit, and this question has to do with nonprofit and educational sites for OTAs. Can you discuss using them as NDCs?
So yeah, so first of all, a nonprofit by definition is considered a large business. You can't be a small business and in a nonprofit. So that's even though we're talking non-traditional versus large versus small. A nonprofit or educational entity, as long as they met the requirements that we discussed, then they can bid on an OT. But again, I would check with the specific. It was a very general statement, so I would check with the specific on the specific solicitation with that particular customer before spending a lot of time on that effort.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this one is a two-part question.
Okay.
So there's a lot of information here too, so just preparing you. What are some strategies to increase our chances of getting the non-competitive OTAs to follow our
Okay.
What are some strategies to increase our chances of getting the non-competitive OTAs to follow our prototype OTA? And if the government does decide to release the contract under FAR-based competition, are there things we can write in early on at prototype OTA phase, for example, to better position ourselves to win the FAR-based contract that follows?
Okay, yeah, there's quite a bit there. So first of all, the ultimate goal, right, is to be able to go through the prototype phase and then to be able to get the follow-on production award. And in terms of best practices, I mean, it's coming up with a solution that has enough discriminators that the government essentially doesn't have another path to go down, right? I mean, if you've eliminated the competition, so to speak, by delivering a superior solution, then the government's gonna typically go down the path of giving you that contract as a direct award, so to speak, on that follow-on production OTA. Can you repeat the second question though? I didn't get that, or the second part of that question.
Yes, I certainly can. Okay, and if the government does decide to release the contract under FAR-based competition, are there things we can write in early on at prototype OTA phase to better position ourselves to win that FAR-based contract that follows?
Yeah, and to me, that just comes down to business development 101, right? The more you understand the customer and you understand their requirements and their hot buttons, and the more you've essentially obviously talked to them to understand that. So if you're already bidding on and performing on an OT contract that's going to then maybe get converted into a production FAR-based contract, you're going to have a huge leg up over your competition because not everybody has been performing on that initial contract. You've had lots of discussions, hopefully, with the customer. You understand their hot buttons. You understand your competition. So I think just performing Capture 101 is gonna give you that leg up that you need.
Great. Okay, so we probably only have time for one or two more questions. We had so many come in, so thank you all so much for typing those in. Okay, here's another one. Do OTAs tend to fall under certain NAICS more often than not?
I don't believe so, but I don't know the answer to that unless you do, Nia.
Well, engineering would probably be one of them for sure.
Yeah.
But I think they're not restricted by NAICS, no. But the question is, do they fall under certain NAICS more than others? It'd probably be closer to the research and development type of NAICS codes in the engineering.
Okay.
Then we got room for one more question, Mallory, or?
Yes, I think we have time for just one more. Sorry, I'm just filtering through a bunch of them. Thank you all so much for submitting these. Okay, we'll go with this one. What are some examples of negotiations legal contracting teams could take with an OTA?
Yeah, so really that's because the government's encouraging open conversations and flexibility. It would be to have your contracting and legal team sit down with the government up front and help shape. I mean, you can even help shape the solicitation before it comes out if you're ahead of the requirement. But just sitting down with them and making sure that all of those different negotiable terms and conditions. We talked about intellectual property and physical property and all the different billing and all that kind of stuff is well understood and documented by both parties. So I would just encourage that open conversation with the government.
Great. Thank you all again for submitting those questions. We love having a Q&A, and thank you all again for joining us. Patrick, Nia, do you have any last words for us?
No, we will be posting this and sending you a copy of the slides and the video. And if anyone has any questions, go to the website. My email is right on that screen right now. So if you want to take that down and email me directly, we'll be more than happy to address any questions and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Everyone.
Appreciate everyone's time today.
Bye.
Thanks for the opportunity. Take care. Bye.